All right. Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast where I talk to a variety of people to spread progressivism, critical thinking, and left-wing politics. Today, I'm talking to Ben Burgis.
Thanks for having me, Cory.
You bet. So I guess a good place to start is just to ask you a little bit about your background, what is your political persuasion?
Sure. So, my day job, I'm a philosophy instructor at Georgia State Perimeter College, although my wife and I have been back in Michigan, which is where I'm originally from, for, pretty much not quite since the start of the pandemic, but, for a lot of that, since, obviously it's all online anyway. And, I've been a socialist, for a very long time, pretty much throughout my adult life, although very inactive, for a lot of that, since I think a lot of people who maybe were, radicalized in the last, 5 or 6 years, like really don't have a good sense of what it was like, before that. It was like Narnia before that, always winter and never Christmas,
Right.
Like, for anybody who had a political position to the left of liberalism, because, up until the last few years, I guess Jacobin is about 10 years old now, although, it certainly wasn't what it is now, until the last several years. The Democratic Socialists of America, up until like 2015 was like a glorified mailing list of a few hundred people.
Right.
And so I was a socialist, before then, but for a lot of that time, like a lot of people, like a lot of people who became active for a little while, and then there was this sort of world of tiny warring sects, and you'd be, involved in it for like a year, and then you'd burn yourself out, and that was kind of the cycle. And so certainly throughout the time I was in, graduate school and all of that, my political activity was pretty much limited to, I'd like read Glenn Greenwald articles from Salon and use them as cheat sheets to argue with my liberal friends about Obama and that was kind of it, right? And whereas in the last several years, since the two Bernie Sanders campaigns and all of that, I've been more, I've been much more politically active, and I was involved in helping, back when I was an adjunct at Rutgers, I was very involved in the adjunct union there, and also in getting Central New Jersey DSA, kind of up and running. But even when all that was going on, let's say 2016, 2017, 2018, that was very much on a different track for me than what I do academically, what I do, in the day job. And it wasn't really until about 2018 that it sort of occurred to me that there was, that I could take things from what I did for a living and use them in ways that would be helpful for people who share my political commitments, and that I could cross those streams productively, and all the sort of media stuff I've done since then has kind of come out of that.
Right. So that's kind of like where the impetus for your book came from.
Yeah. Yeah. No, very much so. So, in that case, it's kind of a funny thing because Doug Lane is the main editor of Zero Books. Someday I'd known from other contexts, like a long time ago. And he had organized this conference in Idaho in 2018 that was, it was kind of, so like the backstory behind this is that he had actually scheduled Jordan Peterson to come on his podcast, Zero Square. That was going to happen. It was on the books. And then Peterson, or maybe somebody who works for Peterson, who knows,
found out what
this podcast was and backed out of it. And then like a week later, Peterson was on the Joe Rogan show And Rogan asked him, hey, dude, what about why do you never debate one of these like equality of outcome Marxists you're always talking about? And he was like, I won't try to do the Kermit the Frog voice, but he said, well, it's because none of them want to talk to me. And so Doug got like pissed off about that enough to that this was, I mean, I'm not sure who originally contacted who or whatever, but he hooked up with this group in Idaho, and this guy Dave Jonathan. They organized this conference, Jordan Peterson, a conference in lieu of debate, and Doug had posted about this. And since I had spent like way more time than was healthy thinking about Peterson purely for the purpose of like arguing with friends and family members on social media, who'd
yeah.
So, and I thought, quasi-academic conference, this is something I could do. So like I sent him a message about doing something at his conference, and then he asked me, because I think I had been posting all the time about this other book that I was working on, which is an academic monograph about the philosophy of logic. So I'd said, working on the logic book today, whatever. And so he said, how would you feel about writing a book about logic for us? And it kind of took me a while to wrap my head around what that would even look like. But then when it did, thought, oh yeah, no, this would be a good thing, right? I'm like for example, I mean, I've always been, back to 2016 when it started, I've always been a fan of Chapo Trap House, but there's this joke that they used to do a lot, where they'd sort of, the premise of the joke was sort of that people who used a lot of logical terminology and talked about logical fallacies and stuff, that was like, that was, the premise of the joke was at the expense of all of that. And every time that came up, it's like, it would really bother me. And then, so I thought, okay, yeah, that there is something here that's worthwhile to just sort of write something to try to show, all right, this is,
logic isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, logic isn't a bad thing. That because I think there are a lot of like really weird misconceptions that people have. Then there's this really bad feedback loop, because on the one hand, there are people who are like, I don't know, angry libertarians who live in their mom's basements, who weaponize like kind of the rhetoric of logic in a certain way. Yep. Yep. And then there are people on the left who sort of react to it, what those people are saying, and it ends up with a lot of people getting the impression that logic has something to do with thinking either that maybe has something to do with civility. Like, I often get the impression that the way people talk about this stuff, that they think that like logical fallacies are like sort of the debate version of like the Marquise of Queensberry rules for boxing, or something like that, or that it has to do with trying to sort of ignoring history and sociology and all of these things, and sort of trying to extrapolate everything from like a few sort of super basic philosophical premises or something like that. And so I wanted to try to push back gently against the perception on parts of the left, and also sort of take the people talking this way on the right down a notch, and say, look, this is not what it is. Like logic is just the study of arguments, when the premises actually give us good reason to believe the conclusion and when they don't. And it's not everything. We shouldn't exaggerate what it can do, but it's worth this is a set of tools that are worth studying, and it's something that should be in your arsenal, that you should be able to break things down in a certain way. Obviously, a lot of a certain amount of this stuff, you can absolutely get, without having ever formally studied it, but there is also some value to this sort of terminology, to the terminology and to nuances that you might not get if you've never thought about it in this way.
Yeah. Like, I mean, obviously I guess it's in the name, skeptical leftist. I got my start in the atheist and skeptical communities, and that was a big deal in those communities, was studying the logical fallacies and how they applied to religion in particular. And it is a very useful framework in a lot of ways. But like you say, like you get all those guys that you say something online and right away you're shot with logical fallacy, this and that, ad hominem, appeal to authority.
Because people use it like, and with all love to to people who come out of the sort of background that you just said, which in a certain way I do. Like I don't like even at the time I was like, even in that sort of new atheism moment, I enjoyed watching like Christopher Hitchens do his thing on YouTube, but I was also a little wary. Like I think I was already like enough of a Marxist to be like a little weirded out by the idea that there was this sort of political movement out of being an atheist that never really made sense to me. But whatever. I mean, like that's stuff that, I mean, obviously I'm a huge philosophy nerd, like the theism, atheism stuff has always been interesting to me. And yeah, like I think that the problem is that, especially in online context, right, whether that's the sort of like atheisty, skeptically stuff or, political versions, that there is a tendency to, like, I mean, this is not like, I think some of this is just that, like, this is just the natural kind of vice of people who are just hearing about this stuff for the first time, that that like, okay, you've got a hammer, everything's a nail, right? So it's like, you have this, you've got like this exciting new set of vocabulary words, and everything suddenly, becomes an example of it. That so if, every time somebody cites expert opinion, that's appeal to authority. Every time somebody says something mean, that's ad hominem. And so I think some of that's just like sort of natural exuberance. It's probably just something that people, maybe as a stage, a lot of people have to go through when they're learning this stuff. But then the problem is too, especially in these kinds of online contexts, that it becomes a point scoring thing, that like, that this is like, this just sort of becomes a way to put people down in like rhetorical battle, in these interactions, which, I mean, trust me, I get the appeal, but it's just not a very helpful way to think about these concepts, because, that's not like, if the goal, I mean, like, what a fallacy is a way that we're reasoning badly, or that you could reason badly. And so if the goal is to reason better, just doing these like 3-second insta diagnoses, oh, you're committing the fallacy, blah, 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 that means you're wrong, right? Like that's
not helpful.
Yeah, it's the least helpful way to deploy these concepts. Like, what you should really be doing is like taking your time and thinking about it. And wait a second, am I reasoning badly? If so, is there a way I could like reframe the argument so like, so I could avoid that mistake? And is there a different way to interpret this argument so it's not necessarily committing that? Like you'd want to sort of, you'd want to think through that, like, rather than just sort of letting this be, rather than just sort of letting this be another genre of like nerdy trivia that people could score points by correcting each other about.
Yeah. The way I often looked at it was, instead of trying to aim it outward, I tried to aim it inward and be like, am I doing this? Like, I can recognize it when other people are doing it, but am I also committing these fallacies or failures in my reasoning?
Yeah, right. No, absolutely. Which is ultimately the, the most important part, because we're interested in reasoning, partially to persuade other people, which does which does happen and is important. And I think that people do often, especially in the left, do underestimate the extent to which people are persuaded by arguments. That like it's this sort of weird thing where you sound very like wise and world weary when you say, oh, nobody's ever actually convinced by arguments, but it's also just not true. People are all the time, maybe not in the room. Right. Like,
not in the heat of the moment per se, but
not in the heat of the moment, because there's too much ego bound up in the moment. Oftentimes, even if you're just a spectator, but you're still attached to the views that are being criticized. There's still too much ego bound up in the heat of the moment. But certainly in my case, and I think I've never really talked to anybody who doesn't have this experience. Like, it could be like weeks later, it could be years later, that like you're. That you're sort of, you find yourself thinking back to the topic and you realize that you feel differently about it than you did before. And that part of the reason you feel differently is because of considerations that you dismissed when you first heard them. I think that's the more psychologically realistic thing that happens.
Yeah.
And I'll say too, like, anyway, whatever. Probably heard me say this before, but like I always find it like really weird when people say these like nobody's ever persuaded things, because like half the time when people say it, like I always think it's like, wait a second, dude, I know you, right? Like you were,
I know you've been,
you were raised in like a conservative evangelical household, and you became an atheist when you were 17 because you were watching, Richard Dawkins videos on YouTube. And then you were just like a regular MSNBC liberal until Bernie ran the first time. And then you end up joining the DSA, and now you're like halfway to Maoism, and you're going to tell me that nobody ever changed your mind, So like the persuasion is certainly part of it for sure. And I think that I think you can admit like all of the psychologically realistic caveats you want about how people aren't like, people are only going to be open to certain sorts of arguments if there are other factors that are going on that make them open to it at that moment, and yada yada yada. There's lots of rhetorical things that have nothing to do with the argument themselves that influence people. All of that stuff. But I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that the arguments are part of what persuades people. So that the persuasion is part of it. But then, like, the other thing that's at least as important, I would actually say more important, is that if we're interested in reasoning, we're interested in it because we want to figure out what's true. And so, like, it doesn't even need to be in the context of a debate between multiple sides. It can just be you trying to work through what you think is true.
Yeah, actually. That makes a lot of sense. Like if you're giving a lot of if you're arguing with people a lot about a particular subject, it's because you're exploring in a sense, right? Like you're not necessarily always going to be out there to convince other people, but because you're looking for other angles on the same ideas that you already kind of feel are true.
Right.
Kind of to shift gears a little bit.
Yeah.
Your show is kind of a debate show sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's similar to but a couple of the more recent debates you've had have been with libertarian types.
Yeah.
And, I consider myself an anarchist. But often the thing that I get hung up with, these libertarians is that they still believe in this concept of private property.
Yeah.
So I'm always like, I'm listening to this and they talk about, well, I get my farm and I can build a fence and I can, I can defend it with my gun or whatever. And I'm just thinking like, but what about the corporation that you didn't take private property from coming with their army and taking that land from you because they want to?
Yeah. Well, I guess there may be a couple things going on there. Like, I think that, I guess the anarchism thing in general, I think that the word anarchism could mean like really different things in different people's hands.
That's true.
I think that, certainly something everybody means by it is that you think at least as some sort of extremely long-term goal that you want a society without, a state in it. And you could say, okay, well, what's a state? and you know,
there's lots of discussion.
Yeah. You know, I think that's also a problem because different anarchists have very different definitions of what a state is. But
true.
But certainly with the private property stuff, well, because I think that there are like two things going on there. What you just said, like one of them is a concern that I have honestly about any form of anarchism, even left anarchism, which is, I mean, this is sort of simple-minded, and I'm sure very frustrating to lots of people who like spend lots of time thinking about this and like have really worked out views and like, you know, and whatever. But like, I mean, I've never been able to completely get over the sort of Mad Max objection to anarchism, which is okay, if you don't have a centralized state, you know, then it seems very likely to me that doesn't mean you're not going to have a state. That just means that you're going to have a bunch of little immortal Joes, filling the gap.
Yeah, like you say, it depends on what you mean by the state, right? A lot of anarchists that I know and have read, we often think of the state as actually less of like, we don't think of it as the government, right? But more like this entity that acts in the interest of those in power or those with capital. So if you have, I guess, like a system of governance that is less, you know, a little bit smaller level, like is in the interest of small communities that can collectively communicate with each other in a way. I think
I get what you're saying. I'm not and I think to a great extent that could, you know, probably get around the first worry, you know, that, if you do have still some form of, you know, collective defense, even if it's very decentralized, you know, then that would, you know, that, I mean, I see how it's responsive to the first worry. I will say that I'm not necessarily sold on like decentralization, being like a good, certainly not an unqualified one in general. That like I think that so one concern I often have about anarchism is I think a lot of concerns that I have about anarchism revolve around the subject of criminal criminal justice, criminal law, right? So I like, because it's one thing to say like okay, like I have not that I think she should call herself an anarchist exactly anyway, unless I'm very mistaken, but like Angela Davis is somebody, you know, I have like tons of respect for. Like I think if there were saints in my view of the world, she'd probably be one of them.
Right.
But she wrote this little book called "Are Prisons Obsolete?" where in the and you know her answer is yes, right? And in the last, but then like almost all the book is spent talking about the really existing prison system and why it's so awful, and you know certainly no argument from beyond that, right? But then the last chapter is the chapter where she finally gets to what the alternative is, and it's pretty head wavy. Right, like it's she doesn't really say what the alternative is. She just sort of says, "Well, here are all of these things that would reduce the amount of crime that would happen dramatically." And it's not that I don't believe that, right? Like I have no trouble believing that in a future classless society would have I'm totally willing to prepare to believe that it's a realistic goal that eventually under socialism that 95% of the kinds of street crime that happen right now, you know, would be a thing of the past. I could
simply won't exist. Yeah.
Yeah. But then I've got all these questions about what happens with the other five, right? Because there are lots of causes of interpersonal violence that have nothing to do with economic inequality, and so rape, domestic abuse, and I know that people will say at this point, well, but we'll also have made some amazing strides in gender equality that'll be relevant here. But then we think, okay, but wait a second. There's not all domestic abuse can be attributed to gender inequality. Like there are plenty of same-sex couples with domestic abuse in them, right? So,
Yep.
So I don't like. So I have all these questions about like what happens there, and one of those, so if there are no prisons at all, right? If there's no form, of involuntary confinement, and then one of my worries about to the extent that like what you mean by statelessness is the lack of a centralized infrastructure, then like people will often use these phrases like, oh, we'll have federated, decentralized communes, right? Which is something that like very easily rolls off the tongue. But then I often question how much people have really, not to
how much of the logistics of it do you really have in mind?
yeah, exactly. It's like and so for example, like let's say that there is a murder on your commune, which there will be. Right, like that is something that will sometimes happen. Like if somebody doesn't grant me that much, I'm not sure. Like I believe they need serious. So there's a murder on your commune, and everybody in your commune thinks you did it. Is there some equivalent in the society to filing for a change of venue?
Well, I mean, you would have to explore that. Yeah, like I don't have a good answer.
And I'm not saying that this is but this is like a knockdown. Oh, you silly anarchist! Now that I've said this, right. But I'm just trying to give you the flavor of the sorts of things that I'm concerned about. When I hear those proposals, and then I guess the other thing going on in your example, where I think we are going to be on the same page, is about is that so you have like your little farm and you put up the fence and all that stuff, but this is often defended in these terms that are like sort of pseudo pacifist, almost like the oh, what you're gonna you're gonna stop me from having my little plot of private land where I can do whatever I want. It's like so like you. So you're gonna use violence and stop me, and it always seems like really like there is this like what strikes me as as a super basic objection to this, which I've never really heard as you say, a lot of these debates end up being with libertarians, which I think part of that is just because like they're the people who enjoy doing this most, and part of that is because there's probably part of that is because I'm a philosophy nerd, and so they're often appealing to these like sort of abstract philosophical justifications, which is territory that I'm very comfortable in. And then part of it is just like there's probably some sort of like weird mutual fascination between people who are willing to question things about the existing society in really radical but sort of opposite ways, sort of overlapping but sort of opposite ways. Like there's this really basic so I've been doing this for a couple of years, and this is really basic objection I've never really heard a good answer to about that exact point, right? Which is that all of this appeal to, oh, you're going to use violence to stop me, and that's it's just like the Matt Brunig argument has always seemed really decisive to me here, which is, well, wait a second, but like putting up that fence and putting a no trespassing sign on the fence, that's the threat of violence, or at least an announcement of a right, to engage in violence. There's no, any arrangement of property is, like any system for distributing resources is going to ultimately be backed up, not actually backed up, one would hope, right? One of the things you want for a society is that there's very little violence in practice, but is backed up in principle by some sort of appeal to force. Because without that, right, then you just have what Brunig calls the grab what you can world, where you can have where somebody, because if all we're interested is, like, libertarians will talk about, self ownership, that, like, my body's inviolate, you can't do it into, my control of my body without, unless I'm the one initiating, the conflict. Okay, fair enough. I can get behind that. But if that's all you're talking about, then, hey, if somebody walks into my apartment without my permission and, proceeds to go into the bathroom and use my toothbrush, if I have, can I stop them? Can I appeal to force in some way? To stop them, dude, you got to leave, or I'm calling the fill in the blank, right? And if you say yes, right? If you say no, then then you've just given up on the concept of property, like, of any kind, because there's no, like, property claims that aren't enforced are just statements of, like, hope, right? They have so. But if you say yes, then we agree that coercion could be used to enforce distribution of resources. We're just arguing about which distribution of resources should be enforced, which is exactly where we should have started anyway before we brought in this silly red herring about violence and coercion.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, I would never say that, say violence is off the table if somebody is coming into the habitation you are in. You're watching your Netflix and some dude just comes in and decides to piss all over the place. No, you have the right to kick his ass.
Reasonable, proportionate, whatever. But right. Yeah. Surely. And the thing is, like, nobody really, I guess not nobody, like, I'm sure you could find members of, like, a few, like, extreme religious sects or whatever, who would disagree. But, like, pretty much nobody disagrees with that, right? Like, that's not actually politically controversial. And so when it looks like we're disagreeing about, like the way the libertarian wants to frame it, should you leave people alone, or is it okay to use violence and coercion? That's not really what we're talking about, right?
It's not actually a dichotomy.
Yeah, what we're really talking about is, like, which claims to the use of which resources by which people should be respected. And that's just a question about, that's just a question about distributive justice. It has nothing to do with all this stuff about violence.
Yeah, for sure. Like, actually, I just had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day. We were talking about housing as a basic human right, and how, ideally we wouldn't have people owning 3 or 4 houses that are empty while people are homeless. Right.
Yeah.
And at some point we would have to start having discussions about, well, how big of a house is fair, is the right size of a house, depending on how big your family is. Are we limiting the size of families? Things like that. We have to have, like, cause he owns a house. I don't, I rent. So we have kind of different perspectives a little bit, but also,
I would say in the housing case, like, right now, I don't know. Sure. We can imagine a situation in which all these issues that you're mentioning come up, right? And for the record, I'm not a homeowner either, but but I think right now, I don't know, like, how much we're really, like, looking down the barrel of that, because, like, right now, I know it's a little bit more complicated than this, because, like, they're not always in the same places and whatever. But, like, just as a basic fact, there are more houses that are owned by banks than there are homeless people in the United States. So
obviously that needs to be fixed right away.
We could do some matchmaking there and solve the problem without taking away any house that's currently occupied by a person. And honestly, to the extent that that solution wouldn't completely work, because they're not always in the same places. I think that the real thing, obviously, I want anybody who has, like, 12 houses or something, like, I'm certain I have no objection to taking some away, or even just pragmatically, jacking up their taxes to the point where, like, they would sell some of them anyway, but I think that the real thing that we should be focusing on is massive new investment in public housing, as I'm sure people who watch this know, like it's not, that term has kind of a bad rap in the United States because, we think of, the projects, whatever, but but there are places in the world where it's a completely normal thing for middle class people to live in public housing.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no reason that couldn't be a major, a major goal of the left. We talk a lot about, Medicare for all, we talk a little, we talk to a certain extent about the college stuff, but I think, I think housing for all, should be probably a much bigger part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting that it doesn't get the headlines the way that you would expect. Like Medicare for all is the big topic in the US. I mean, I'm from Canada, so we have a little bit different situation, but
yeah, well, you have it.
Sort of, yeah.
I mean, it doesn't include everything, pharma and whatever, but like you do have Medicare for all, like so it's which is
it's a big step forward.
yeah, exactly. Which sounds like sounds amazing. It makes me very actually I have a friend that actually is the guy who did the I'm sure you've heard his work, even if you don't know him. The guy who did the intro music. It does the intro music for my show.
Okay.
Who it's pretty much spent his life in California, and he he just married a Canadian woman and moved to Canada. And just after that happened, he slipped on the ice and shattered his leg, and it's I've seen the pictures. It's really bad, but it's also like I did have the thought, at least as awful as I felt for him, it's like, well, at least you're not going to be bankrupted by this.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, you're covered.
Yeah.
At least in to some extent, like your income is still whatever.
Sure.
If you rely on labor, then you'd still be in trouble. But
right.
But yeah, you're not going bankrupt.
Not to be hit with the $10,000 hospital bill.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's interesting. Like you say, I just had a discussion with a co-host on another podcast that I do. And we were talking about how much cheaper it actually is to provide housing to people than it is to criminalize them and send them off to jail and then have to, put them in shelters and this and that and the other thing. And
yeah,
it's just ridiculous.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I can't rattle it off the top of my head, but I mean, I know that there are, there are article studies about this that that if you give people give people a place to live and a just temporary income stream, for you don't have to do it for that many months for the vast majority of them to have their lives together and be self-sustaining afterwards. So it's just it's just. I mean, we could speculate about why it is that we don't do that, but it is just gratuitously cruel that that there are all these wealthy countries that that don't just do that as a matter of course.
Yeah, no kidding. So I guess it's we're getting closer and closer to the end of the hour. So I guess I'll ask you about identity politics.
Sure. Yeah.
A lot of people on the left are really anti-identity politics. They frame it in such a way that they that it's like a bourgeois type thing. It's liberals are the only radical liberals or rad libs are the only people who are worried about it. But then you get some other people that talk about it, like trans rights and Black Lives Matter, stuff like that are really important to their particular projects. And I'm just wondering what you think of that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the first thing I'd say about it in a way, it's sort of structurally parallel to what we're saying about anarchism is that there's a lot of this that depends on what you mean. So I think,
suppose, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, because I think that phrase identity politics, I mean, look, I'm not going to throw throw stones. I'm sure I've used it at some point or another, like as a, without like, without defining it, just like throwing it out as if it was
Everybody knows what I mean, right?
yeah. Which is the problem, because so many people do that, but they mean incompatible things by it. And so I think that, because I mean, identity politics, I think very often when, especially in the intra-left context, I think people who criticize identity politics mean things that maybe not are completely different, but I think are different to a large extent than what people who might defend it mean by it, right? Like what people are attacking and what people are defending are often very different. And I'm not saying that to do a like kumbaya, we all actually agree on all this stuff and there are no real differences, because I think there are real differences. But I think those differences often aren't well understood, right? So I think the two examples that you just gave probably help illustrate that, right? Because certainly in the trans rights case, I mean, I don't know. Well, all right, try to think, because anytime I say I don't know anybody who says X, like you can almost always find someone somewhere who thinks X. But like, let's at least say hardly anyone, right? Like there is hardly anyone on the left, and who doesn't support trans rights, if what we mean by that, is both as a matter of like the social cultural issue that like you should call people by the pronouns they want to be called by, and certainly as a legal issue, we would we should like add gender identity to anti-discrimination ordinances, I mean, you're in Canada, right? Like C-16, like that makes it like nice and concrete, right? Like who
still zero people arrested under
yeah. Which is it's amazing. Years later, I still have Jordan Peterson fans telling me, well, someday they could be. But like, I don't know anybody on the left who's against that. Right? Like, I don't know anybody on the left who's against extending laws such that you can't discriminate against trans people in housing and employment and all that stuff. I suppose it's possible that there is some like decrepit old Stalinist somewhere, who disagrees with that. But
well, I did see a screenshot of a tweet by someone who called themselves Maoist feminist, who said that trans gender issues were bourgeois indulgences.
Okay, so at Maoist feminist disagrees, but I think that's about it, right? Like that's certainly in terms of people who are sometimes viewed with suspicion on these topics, people who might get accused of like a buzzword that's sometimes thrown around here is class reductionism, might be accused of class reductionism, like your Adolf Reeds, I don't even know, your Freddie De Boers, your Ben Burgesses, right? I don't know any of these people, right? Who don't support who don't support the anti-discrimination ordinances, who don't think that of course you should call people whatever pronouns they want to be called. I think and then similarly on the Black Lives Matter front, although I think this one gets a little bit more complicated, and I think there are more real political differences there. I just don't think that the shape of those political differences is people saying this is important versus people saying nah, right? I think the shape of the political differences has more to do with things like, okay, how should we understand do we think that so is not so much are police abuses and police killings a real thing, or are police killings and police abuses, is there an element of racial prejudice, that is part of the problem? Again, I don't, I don't know if we've consulted at Maoist feminists, but I certainly don't know. I certainly don't know anybody who disagrees with those two things, right?
Right.
Or we could add in number 3, supports the mass protests that happened, last summer after the murder of George Floyd. I don't know anybody who disagrees with those 3 things. Where I think you do start to get disagreement is about things like is the best way to frame that issue in primarily racial terms, right? Or is that maybe not the best way to do it? Not because there isn't a racial component. Of course there is, right? I don't think anybody denies. I don't think anybody denies that, right? Certainly. Especially if you think about how police killings actually happen, that in the oftentimes when a cop is deciding whether to shoot somebody or not, right? That's a split-second thing. Any prejudices that are in their head are going to play a role at that moment.
Yeah.
Right. That's so I think that is for sure true. But then the point that I would make is that I think that I don't, even though that is for sure true, I'm not convinced that the main reason, right? Again, it is a reason, but I'm not convinced that the main reason why Black people are disproportionately far more likely than white people to be victims of police killings is because of that. I think the main reason for that disproportion is that poor people are more likely to be victims of police killings, and due to the history of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, etc., Black people, the distribution of poverty between Black people and white people is so wildly uneven. And the reason, I realize it's kind of okay, why, this is kind of a weird nitpicky point to to be hung up on, what's the point here? And the point, as I would just see it, is that I think that there's a legitimate. I think that framing this purely as an issue about racism is unnecessarily limited, because ultimately what we want, right, is for poor white people not to under the sort of Black Lives Matter framing, the role of any white person, right, is to be an ally, right? There's the people who are fighting on behalf of their interests, and then there are allies. And I think a more useful framing would be one that says this is an issue that anybody who lives in a poor neighborhood should be all over as a matter of self-interest, that this is something that's not just that's not just about that, about anti-racism and being an anti-racist ally, which is, for a lot of reasons we could get into, as a word that I really hate, that we need class solidarity to see this kind of militarized policing, as a problem for the working class in general, and I think that's and I would also, so I think there are real political disagreements about stuff like that, and then maybe there are, so I guess I'd say the things that strike me as real political disagreements aren't, should we care about racist police killings, or should we support trans rights? I don't think those are real political disagreements on the left, not in any significant way. I think the things that are real political disagreements are, on the one hand, maybe analytic disagreements about how to think about these different sort of categories of injustice. And so, do you think that, okay, there's something called race, and there's something called class, and there's, you added a bunch of others, and these are on sort of the same conceptual level. These are forms of oppression, and then and they're largely separate, but they just sort of intersect, right? That's one framing. And then another framing is to say that no, these are basically unlike categories. So what I mean by saying that they're basically unlike categories is that things like race or gender or keep going, right? Like are identity categories. So what I mean by identity categories is that they're a matter of how people are classified or categorized, like how either how you identify yourself, right, or how others identify you with or without your consent, and then how other people treat you on the basis of those categorizations. And I'm not saying that that's unimportant. I think an awful lot of the misery and injustice that's around us takes exactly that form. But I think that's a very different thing than what we're talking about. We talk about class, which is a matter of objective economic structures and really has very little to do with how you identify yourself or how other people identify you, right? Like, so what I mean by that, right, is just like you and your, like, let's say you work in a factory and with like 20 other people, and it's like, just for sake of simplicity, there's like one guy who owns it. Sure. And so it could be that all 20 of you and your boss, or I guess you and 20 coworkers, okay, 22 people, all 22 people in this scenario are hardcore free market libertarians who don't believe in the existence of class, and you think that you're just all free agents coming together in the marketplace, and that there's no sense in which you're part of something called the working class and your boss is part of something called the capitalist class. It's nonetheless objectively true and important that you are part of the working class, your boss is part of the capitalist class, and you're still being just as exploited no matter how everybody thinks about these categories. And so, like, the disconnect that I'd see is, like, if somebody tells me, if somebody who was, male at birth, tells me that they identify as, what would I say? Okay, great, right? I will, change my language and everything accordingly. If somebody tells me, like, if somebody, like, in that context, like when I used to, be an activist for the adjuncts union at Rutgers, said, "Oh, I don't need to be a union. I'm not a worker. I'm a middle class professional." I don't say, "Okay, I respect your identity." I say,
absolutely not.
Yeah, I say you're fooling yourself, right? Like,
that's right.
And that's the analytic distinction that I make. And then I think there are some, like, more concrete political differences sometimes, although they're often, like, messy and dubious and complicated. I guess I would say that I'm sure I don't always succeed in this, but I try not to just use this generic term identity politics because it means too many things to too many different people. Like, right. Like I think that we're almost always better off using more, more specific terms, like, you can talk, like one of the things that I think people are sometimes rightly objecting to when they object to identity politics is what's sometimes called, like, identitarian deference, which is the idea that that you instead of just sort of trying to figure out what you think is true about some subject, right? You should defer to what people in some categories say about it, which, I think might even be legitimate in some contexts, and right, to a certain point, right? But I do tend to think that we often overdose on it on the left, and it's something that's very, and I also think it's dangerous because it's a game that can be played in so many different political directions. I've seen. It's almost, I feel like I'm going into the speech in Blade Runner. You wouldn't believe the things that I've seen, right? I've seen, like, woke Zionists, like accusing people of goy-splaining anti-Semitism to them by saying that, that anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. And so I think it's something that, at least as a matter of degree, we're better off stepping away from. And I do get that that's something like that. That's the sort of critique that I think people often have in mind when they say that identity politics, but I also think it's probably not helpful to express that critique by talking about identity politics. One, because some people, what they'll hear isn't what you mean to get across. What they'll hear is, oh, so you're saying that any sort of identity-based struggle for justice is unimportant, and that's not helpful.
Right.
And then just because just for the sake of specificity, and then also, frankly, because I think it's not a good idea. Like you mentioned that term, radlib earlier, which is something that
gets thrown around a bit.
yeah, and people I have a lot of respect for sometimes do throw it around, and people who I think are like what they mean by it, I'm largely in sympathy with, sometimes throw it around, and I see what they mean. But I also think that it's a really unhelpful thing to do, right? So I have a whole book that's about all this stuff that's coming out, but in that book, one of the decisions I made was I wasn't going to use that or anything like that, in the book, because one, it flattens, distinctions. Oftentimes people have nuanced views that aren't really well captured by this, but two, it's just as a matter of basic human psychology, it's like I think that if you have to, if you're trying to convince people that you see as comrades who see things in a slightly different way than you do, the least helpful thing that you can do is put some insulting label on them and say that you are basically this thing, that's just something that leads to the hardening of battle lines, and I don't think that's I don't think that's helpful. I think that I think that this is just one of those things where it's I think if we had, all right, I guess now this does sound pretty kumbaya-ish, but I think less labeling and more using complete sentences to say what you mean would be helpful.
Yes, something that I thought of while you were talking also was a perfect example of not deferring to a person of color necessarily is Candace Owens. I'm not going to her for any discussion on racism.
Yeah, and this is the thing, because I'm sure everybody would sort of agree with that, but on the left, would agree with that. But then it gets really messy when you explain why not, right? Because you say, well, no, she doesn't count. It's okay, why doesn't she count? And if the reason she doesn't count is because she's not speaking in the interests of black people, or she's a pawn of white people, or something like that, then it sort of sounds like you've already decided what to think, and the deference isn't really doing any work. That it's just sort of a redundant rhetorical gesture at that point. And I think it's also you could do a poll, but I don't know how far that's going to get you, because for one thing, they. Bad news, right? If you're a radical leftist, most of those polls of most oppressed groups aren't going to come out the way you want them to. Yeah. Even on the policing issues we were talking about earlier, we could, on the left, we argue about whether we should see our long-term goal as completely abolishing the police, or whether there's some sort of really minimalistic sort of trimmed down version that would still be okay. But look, you actually look at polls of black Americans, and most of them don't agree with either of those positions, right? People either say the amount of police presence in my neighborhood is about right, or I think that's 60% or something, or they're 20% who are there should be more. And I'm certainly not saying therefore we shouldn't, have the view that we do about the police. I'm just saying that appeals to what people in some group currently think aren't going to take us very far, because most people in most groups aren't very radical politically. Like that's kind of the problem. And then it gets like really weird when you start thinking like, Matt Bruning's essay about this, I think it's called like, what does identitarian deference require? He talks about how, like, if you think about, okay, like the sort of most basic possible, and not the most basic possible, but like maybe the most high profile, right? One of the more high profile, feminist issues in countries like the United States and Canada is about reproductive freedom. And okay, in that case, at least like most women do support abortion rights. And there is a gender gap. There are more women than men who support it, but that gender gap is not nearly as big as you might think.
Right.
Lots of anti-abortion women out there. So, and it doesn't like stretch the limits of imagination to imagine cultural changes that could flip it from being 60-40 in the direction it's in to being 60-40 in the other direction. And then you really want to say, okay, well, I guess we should listen to women and oppose abortion rights. That'd be a really weird thing to say, So like, I think that none of this is to say that there might not be context in which it makes sense to say, like, to do what I think people are sort of getting at when they'll say like, oh, you should check your privilege or whatever, which is that you should like sort of take a step back and take a moment to think, okay, is it possible that there's something basic that I'm not getting here because I haven't had a certain set of experiences, and to like really think about that, right? I think there is some value to that exercise, but also since, oppressed groups are not hive minds, and you're going to get like tons of disagreement within all of them about all of this stuff. If you actually want to come out on the right side, like, and I guess this takes us back to what we were talking about in the first half. Like you do just kind of have to think about it. Like you can't just turn your brain off and be like, well, I'll just do whatever the oppressed people say, because the oppressed people are going to disagree amongst themselves, and ultimately you're going to have to go back and try to think through it and try to figure out what's true.
It always strikes me as a thing one of my best friends told me back when I was first exploring anarchism. He said, there are no easy outs in political philosophy. So stop trying to find the easy clickbait answer that you can put in a tweet.
Yeah, right. Which is I think is a serious like problem in itself, because things that you can put in a tweet like make people feel good, right? Like there's something like anything that's sort of on that level, that you can express it in 280 characters or putting on a bumper sticker, whatever, like feels like that's something that, like, if you're affirming things like that, then that makes you feel like you're like very securely on the side of righteousness. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I think that like political struggle is not a philosophy seminar. Like you do have to eventually figure out how to boil things down like that, for sure. Right. But like, I guess my plea would be like, but like, don't actually skip the philosophy seminar. That's important.
You still have to think about it. Just don't go straight to the tweeting.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, I've taken up enough of your time. I assume people would be able to find you easily, but in case they don't know, where can people find your content?
So the show is called Give Them an Argument. And so if you just type that into YouTube, you find that. And everything else, probably the easiest thing is just go to benburgis.com, BURGIS, and you can get, you can find the show there. You can find the Jacobin articles. You can find, links to places to order the book and all of that. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, Cory.
Thank you for joining me. All right, folks, that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. Remember to share the show with your friends and on social media. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. Every dollar I get makes it so that I can feed my family and keep a roof over our head. So it's really, really appreciated. If you can contribute or want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send me money at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. If you can't contribute financially, that is fine. A 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out my Linktree at linktree/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, and The Feminist Family, which I do with my partner. My Twitter is @HardcoreSkeptic, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Or you can send me a friend request at facebook.com/cjbrainstorm. I do accept most friend requests. Thank you so much for listening or watching. And remember that the truth does seem to have a left-wing bent.